Hello, and welcome to the R3 podcast. Today's episode is with Mark Buckley from Companies House. Mark is the implementation lead on Authorised Corporate Service Providers at Companies House. As members will know, the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act will introduce several changes, including identity verification and data sharing. In terms of identity verification, the Act will require individuals who register companies or file with the registrar will have to prove they are who they say they are by verifying their identity. This includes insolvency practitioners. So Mark has kindly joined me on the podcast to talk about ID verification, authorised corporate service providers, and why they matter to IPs. Like with all podcasts, it is important to stress that whilst care has been taken in the preparation of this podcast, it is intended for general guidance only and does not constitute legal advice. Hello, Mark.
Hey, how are you doing?
Not bad, you?
Yeah, good.
Welcome to the R3 podcast and to R3 HQ. You are my first in-person guest, so thank you for making the trip.
You're welcome.
So part one is all about understanding ACSPs and why they matter to IPs. So, Mark, could I ask you by explaining what an Authorised Corporate Service Provider is and why this new registration is being introduced?
So an Authorised Corporate Service Provider, bit of a mouthful, ACSP, is essentially presents information on behalf of another company. Okay, so a third-party presenter. We have those now. The difference between an ACSP and what we currently have is that an ACSP has to be formally registered with a registrar so that we know who they are. We'll also know who their employees are, filing on behalf of the ACSP. Okay, so then when we introduce the presenter requirements, sort of spring, summer 2026, IDV will tell us who is on the public register and that they are real people, whereas presenters will tell us exactly who is filing information on the public register, and we'll be able to trace it back to the individual. So if there are false filings, that's why ACSP and the presenter requirements are important. As well as ACSPs, directors and PSCs and employees of companies, if they file on behalf of their own company, they'll also have to provide us ID credentials as well. So it's not just third-party providers, but third-party providers is a sort of step change from where we are now.
Thank you. Is it correct that IPs will need to be registered as an ACSP to file common insolvency forms like notices of appointment or final reports in the future? And when does this mandatory filing requirement come into effect? Is there like a deadline? I know you meant spring 2026.
So spring, summer 2026 is when we are currently looking to sort of mandate the presenter requirements. So you have to be either director or PSC or an employee of a company, provide your IDV, or an authorised corporate service provider. So those are the two sort of presenter requirements at the moment. Okay. So it's then that IPs will need to consider whether or not they actually need to be an ACSP. I think an ACSP is obviously a presenter on behalf of another company. So IPs presenting on behalf of themselves. In certain insolvency, winding ups, for example, the powers of the director have ceased. The IP is in overall charge of the company, but is he or she an actual director of that company? Is that route applicable? Or do they need to be an ACSP? I think that would be the question that would need to be asked. Obviously, other forms of insolvency, the directors are still in charge of the company, so the insolvency practitioner would be filing things on behalf of the company, so they would need to be an ACSP in those circumstances. But I think it would be down to the IP to understand what its relationship is with the company and then decide whether or not it needs to be an ACSP or whether or not they need to be IDV'd and then are presenting as a sort of de facto director of a company.
So in most circumstances, an IP will be acting on behalf of the company, say a liquidator or an administrator. In those circumstances, it would be an authorised corporate service provider, is that correct?
Potentially, yeah.
Right, okay. When would it not be an ACSP?
So for liquidations, it could potentially be filing as a director, so that could just be IDV. But for an administration, for example, if the directors are actually still in charge of the company, then whatever the IP is doing is actually on behalf of that company rather than as the company, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, it kind of makes sense.
It's complicated.
Yeah.
I know DBT and The Insolvency Service have been in discussions recently over the impact of presenter requirements on the IPs. The Insolvency Service are going away and potentially looking with their legal team at the impacts. At the moment, the only types of presenter are as a director or an employee of a company. So that's IDV, your IDV credentials when you file information, or as an Authorised Corporate Service Provider.
Okay, gotcha. Moving on to part 2. So the registration process for IP firms. Who within an IP firm is responsible for completing the ACSP registration? For instance, does it need to be a specific appointment taking IP, a director within the firm, or a senior manager?
So it pretty much depends, on how that IP or firm is supervised. So if the firm is supervised, then it would be, if it's an incorporated company, it would be a director of that company would need to IDV and make the appointment, make the ACSP registration. If it's the individual who is supervised, then that individual will need to make an appointment, an ACSP registration for themselves. Even if that individual is linked to a limited company, if the limited company is not supervised, but the individual is, the individual will make the appointment. If it was me, Mark Buckley, make the appointment. Mark Buckley Limited is my firm on the register, but I'm supervised in my own right, whereas I'm running my business through my limited company. If that makes sense. So the ACSP has to be sort of registered depending on how they are supervised. And that's no different to the way that normal companies, not that IPs are normal, but normal sort of non-IP based organizations are currently supervised. Some supervisors only supervise individuals, but those individuals are registering as sole traders and individuals and then giving us their firm name as trading as, whatever it may be, whether that be a non-limited or a limited company. So we've got the details, but we've got the person that's supervised. It'll be no different for insolvency practitioners.
Does the IP himself or herself register as the Authorised Corporate Service Provider, or does the IP firm register, just to be clear?
If the firm is supervised, it'll be the firm.
Okay, yeah.
If the individual is supervised, it'll be the individual. Now, IP firms, larger firms, the firm will be the ACSP. Most of the IPs are also supervised individually, but they're actually working as employees for the firm. So if the firm is supervised, the firm will then add all of the insolvency practitioners to its ACSP as employees, and they'll do that by setting up accounts themselves. They won't have to IDV as part of that process, and they will link their account to the ACSP account and then file through Companies House via that account as an employee.
What are the first sort of practical steps an IP firm or IP individual should take to register it as an ACSP? Can they use their existing Company House account, or is a new gov.uk one?
When they come to register as an ACSP, depending on which route they take, when they register as an ACSP, they'll be given an ACSP number, which is like a company number. It'll have AP prefix and then goes from 1 up to however many ACSPs we eventually end up having. You'll be given that. They'll also get a new one login ACSP account. That is different to any other account that we currently have because they'll have the ability to add their own employees to that account. So there's 3 levels within that account. There's the top level that'll have master control over the account. They'll be able to close the ACSP through that account as well. The next level down is administrator. That administrating level will be able to add and remove employees. And then the bottom level will be the people that will do the majority of the transactional things. They'll only be able to do the transactional things. But each of those will have an individual Companies House account. That account will be linked to the ACSP. So regardless of who's actually doing an individual filing, we'll be able to trace it back to an individual within an organisation.
Okay.
So if, for example, not that any of your members will be in this state, but if, for example, there was a fraudulent filing, we'll be able to trace it to the time, the date, the individual, and then work with the ACSP to rectify that process.
The published guidance that is out there at the moment mentions an AML membership number.
Yeah.
So IPs are supervised by their RPBs, like the IPA, ICAW, ICAS, which also act as their AML supervisors. What's the specific number or identifier should IPs be looking for from their RPB?
That's a really, really good question. And currently we are running at 25% reject rate. So we've registered just over 3,200 ACSPs. We've rejected just under 1,300. 1,280 of those are because people are getting the AML number wrong.
Okay.
We've ingested data from, I think it's 19 out of the 25 supervisors. We also access HMRC's data set, which is a public data set. Check with your supervisor to make sure which number they've provided us for supervision. So we don't take all of ICAW or ICA's data. We only take their AML supervised cohort. Check which number they provided us for your organisation. Simply saves you having to go through the application, register, pay the £55 fee. That's rejected because the number's wrong. Then you have to check with that ICAW and then make another application. And in the background, we are having to do work to refund the original fee and all those things. My one advice, and it is the biggest reject, is to check
The membership number.
Check the membership number that they provided us.
Thank you very much for that one. You mentioned the fee. What is the current registration fee? And is this a one-off or is it a recurring annual fee?
It's currently £55. That is subject to change because obviously Companies House has to do its fees based on cost. So costs go up, the fee will go up. But it is a simply one-off registration fee. There are no subsequent direct costs for any further transactions as an ACSP.
Oh, great. That's pleasing to hear. So how long should IP firms anticipate the application approval process will take? And are there sort of any common pitfalls that might delay it? I think you mentioned, obviously, the membership being the biggest one.
Currently, I was looking at the stats this morning. It's taken us 1.1 days. If we've got the data, it takes about 90 seconds because it's a data in, it's a digital check, and it just flies onto the system. If we've got to query the data, or we don't hold data because we don't hold data for all supervisors. So some of the smaller supervisory bodies, we don't hold data for IPA, for example, but then we aren't expecting insolvency practitioners to start onboarding at this stage because we aren't expecting insolvency practitioners to do IDV and things like this. But if we did start seeing a lot of applications, then I'd speak to colleagues within IPA to sort of ingest their data for that purpose. So if we don't have data, then we make a query with the supervisor. That query, we've got a sort of SLA with them that it's 5 working days to turn it around. Nearly all of them are turning it around much faster than that. But that's why the average is 1.1 days for an accepted transaction.
I may cover this later on with a question, but you mentioned onboarding and IP's not onboarding as yet. When do you expect them to start the onboarding
I'll
process?
probably start engaging with IPA sort of autumn this year. That's not to say that I haven't already got relationships with IPA. It's just that when we spoke to them, I think we both agreed that we need to focus on the likes of ICAW, HMRC, ACCA, AAT, any other acronym you can think of. Yeah. And we've worked extensively with the organisations who we felt would be registering the most transactions with us.
Okay.
So, an anecdote, I didn't think that any transactions from the faculty office of the Archbishop of Canterbury would actually make an application.
Yeah.
But the first application we received was from the Archbishop of Canterbury's faculty office,
Wow.
supervised cohort. And as a result, we didn't have data.
Yeah.
So I had to swiftly sort of speak to the faculty office. And, I built a relationship from there and we were in the process of solving that. But yeah, so that's why, we got the data for all of the big ones. Some of the smaller ones, either through my own incompetence or just because we've had discussions. I think one organisation's only actually got 3 people within their entire cohort that are TCSPs and could actually apply. So we haven't got their data and we've registered 2. We're just waiting for the 3rd to come in and then that's us done. So we aren't in the purpose of just ingesting data of people just to have the data. If there's a need and there's a transactional need, we'll engage. But if there isn't, then we won't.
Let's move on to part 3, which is AML supervision and the role of the RPB. So the guidance states that ACSPs must be supervised by a UK AML supervisory body. So how does this interact with the IP's existing supervision by the RPB for anti-money laundering purposes?
Okay, so the current supervision for AML under the AML is wholly separate to the ACSP regime. But when the Act was going through Parliament, parliamentarians and policy people wanted to make sure that the registrations as an ACSP were linked to only UK-based money laundered sort of supervised entities. So initially, it's only those who are supervised within the UK can actually apply to be an ACSP. There is legislation to be able to widen the scope out to other countries with an equitable AML regime, but that hasn't been enacted. But from day one, it's only those sort of UK AML supervised entities can actually apply.
So are there any specific actions IPs need to take regarding their RPB before or during the ACSP application process?
I don't think so. The only thing they need to be aware of is we'll be asking for credentials that only they and their RPB should know about them, such as the unique identifier.
Yep.
And I know that some RPBs issue where it's individuals and firms. They'll issue a firm number and an individual number. Yeah, and depending on how they register, we would need either one of those. Yep. So I think that's an important check. Make sure that if you're a corporate entity, make sure that the data on the public record is the same as the data held by your RPB. So if you've changed your company name on the public record, but haven't done that with your RPB or vice versa, then if that data doesn't match, even if the numbers match, again, it's a legit reason. And we've had a few instances of that where I've had to contact RPBs to get data sort of aligned so that we could affect the registration.
Part 4, identity verification, a new responsibility. So a significant new aspect seems to be identity verification. So from the 8th of April this year, ACSPs can inform Companies House they've verified a client's identity. Could you explain what this means in practice for an IP verifying, for example, director's identity?
If an IP wanted to verify director's identity, to file that information with the register, I don't know under what circumstances they would need to do that, because they take over the company when it's already in train. Yeah. So theoretically, the director should already be identity verified at that point. But hypothetically, if they did, then they would need to either have the technical sort of capability digitally to identity verify individuals, that's sort of data out of passports, facial recognition, checking addresses, historic address for 12 months that is linked to that individual. Okay. Once they gather that information, they can also use other forms of information to get that individual up to Companies House standards. So it doesn't have to be an NFC chipped passport. There are a lot of other documents in our guidance that can be used and combined together to get them. Once they've got it and they are happy that it's the Companies House standard, then they can simply go onto the portal, which will be in their account, and then type the information in. So it's name, date of birth, address, off the passport, obviously the verified credentials. Yep. They can also give us a name that individual wants to be known by on the public record. So for example, if somebody has got their married name on their passport, but they are known professionally in their previously sort of maiden name or non-married name, then they can give us that information as well. The information that they use to identify that individual, so whether that be a passport or a driving license or other documentation, some of those documents we would then need things like passport number, expiry dates, those kind of things. Key that in, press send, that hits our system. Our system will then fire off a personal code or unique identifier to the identified director and then send an acknowledgement back to the IP to say, thank you for identifying your client and use the reference.
Will IPs be responsible for verifying the identity of directors of companies they are appointed over?
No. Identity verification is purely voluntary for ACSPs to do. It's not voluntary for directors not to do it, but for an ACSP can choose to do IDV, it's not a mandatory requirement for them.
Okay.
All right. So if an IP takes over a company, they should expect that those directors have had their identities verified at that point. So, for example, when we go live, company sets up, the directors will have to have had their ID verified at the point of incorporation. If they're also the PSC, then the identity will also have to be done at that point as well. If the PSC of that company is not a director, they'll have an additional 14 days to get their ID completed. So any new company forming, when we go live in sort of late autumn this year, will have to have IDV in order to incorporate. For existing companies, we are giving them a year of transition around the anniversary of the confirmation statement. Within that first month, there are 7.5 million transactions that we have to get onto the record in that year. About 6.5 million unique individuals. It works out at around 670,000 IDs that we have to get. If you just split by 12, not taking in peak filing and things like this. So it's a heck of a lot of transactions that we've got to ingest and get people's ID verified onto the public domain. So we've done that via the confirmation statement to sort of chunk it up and spread it out over the course of the year to make it easier for us, but also to make it easier for companies to comply. So as I say, if an IP takes over a company in that transitional year and their confirmation statement isn't due until after they've been appointed as a CVL, then Director's ID isn't due until the confirmation statement is due, and the IP's been appointed ahead of when those directors are expected to IDV. So at that point, particularly CVL, MVL, wind-up orders, the powers of the directors cease anyway. So at the point that the IP is appointed, technically there's no IDV to do. So the IP would then just take over the company, deal with the assets as they would normally. If they take over after the confirmation statement is due, that confirmation statement has been filed, then all of the directors will already be IDV'd. So again, there should be no need for them to do the identity verification.
Great. So if, say, an IP is appointed, the company's directors are meant to verify, but they haven't done so, is there any fines levied on the company? Potentially.
Yeah.
Part 5 now, managing the ACSP account and team access. Once an IP firm is registered as an ACSP, how is the account managed?
Okay, so they'll have an account. Each of their employees, whoever they are, will need to set up a Companies House account, and that new Companies House account will be able to be bound to the ACSP account. And once that's done, it should be fairly straightforward. What we have had is people having an ACSP account and then trying to bind their existing works emails, which aren't associated with the registrar, to that account. That doesn't work. So each employee has to go away, set up a one login account, because that's where Companies House is moving to over time, is the new one login accounts. Set up a one login account, and then that'll get bound to the ACSP account. And then that can be removed if that employee leaves the organisation. All of that is managed within the ACSP account dashboard by the ACSP. Companies House doesn't have any input into sort of removing and adding employees.
Okay, so say if you've got an IP firm, it's registered as an ACSP, and then the individual, the employees you mentioned would be the IPs. Then that IP could share that login with, say, a staff member to do the filing on their behalf.
No, so technically the IP and their staff would all be employees, yeah? So the IP, if he does transactions in him or herself, would do that via their own one login account, yeah, which is linked to the ACSP. If they've delegated responsibility down to a team, each member of that team would have their own account. So no matter who within that IP firm files on behalf of that particular insolvency, each one will have a unique presenter attribute associated with that filing, so that if there was anything wrong with any of those filings, we could trace it back to an individual within the firm.
Understood. Can multiple staff members within a firm, in case administrative support staff, be given access to file documents or perform verifications under the firm's ACSP registration? Do these additional users need to verify their own identities?
So the additional users don't need to verify their identity, but they do need to set up an account.
So the published guide also mentions different user roles like account owners, administrators, and standard users.
Yeah.
How might an IP firm utilise these different roles?
So obviously, depending on the scale of the firm, yeah, and we've got everything from multinational ACSPs to individual run organisations. So the director or person responsible for the firm or entity sets up the ACSP. They may or may not want to stay as the top administrator on that account. It depends on how they set the account up, which email and which account they use, okay? So that they might delegate that to the MLRO within the organisation, for example. But the director will have to set it up. They will have to IDV because that's the requirement, all right? But then they give us an email and responsibility within that company or organisation. That is the sort of top level access. That person can then delegate down to an administrative level. There can be as many people in that administrative level as that organisation needs. Those administrators can then add and remove the people at the bottom who can only then do transactional stuff. So the people at the bottom layer can only do transactional things. The administrative layer in the middle, they can add and remove employees in the same way that they're doing it now. So if an employee leaves, you've got to take the laptop off them, got to remove access. All of these things, it's the same for this account. And then the top layer will have ultimate access over that account. And it's only at that layer will they be able to sort of fire off a request to Companies House to say, our organisation is no longer required. We want to shut the ACSP down, please. but they will also be able to add administrators, add people at the bottom as well. So they'll be able to do everything, and subsequent layers as you go down have less access into the system to do things.
So part 6, ongoing responsibilities and compliance for IP firms as ACSPs. So what are the key responsibilities an IP firm has once registered as a ACSP? The public guidance mentions notifying Companies House of changes within 14 days. What kind of changes?
Okay, so if you move supervisor, you've got to tell, there's a statutory requirement to tell us within 14 days. There is an offence associated with telling us 15, 16, 17 days. And I'm currently in the process of developing the compliance team that'll work specifically on authorised corporate service providers. And bearing in mind that's a much broader sort of scope than IPs. IPs is one big subsection of presenters within the organisation. But then we've got incorporation agents, we've got people that deliver charge information, people that deliver just accounts, and there are likely to be tens of thousands of ACSPs filing millions of documents a year. So we need to be able to manage that, work with ACSPs to make sure that the information getting onto the public register is accurate, it's not fraudulent. If we identify fraudulent or suspicious activity, we have the powers to sort of engage with ACSPs to find out why, get them to stop. If they don't stop, then we got more nasty powers in terms of suspension and cessation, which we can use. Then the registrar's role, or one of the key roles, is to make sure that the information on the public record is accurate and not to cause harm to the public. So if there is fraudulent information which is potentially damaging to the public, it's our role to make sure that we protect the public. So we will work with ACSPs in the first instance because we are aware that ACSPs are often victims themselves. So we'll work with the ACSPs to sort of say, okay, well, this information is inaccurate, it's fraudulent, suspicious, or whatever the terminology we use. It was filed by this person. They might go back and say, well, actually, we've looked at the due diligence we did on this individual, and it turns out that, we were lied to. We've tightened up our processes. That doesn't manifest itself again. We'll deal with that issue. The ACSP will continue. If we see something on a big scale, we might have no option initially, but to suspend the ACSP to manage that keep happening, then work with the ACSP to get their controls tightened. If they do control them, happy days. If they don't, then we'll be into more serious compliance and enforcement action.
Specifically for IPs using insolvency software that might file directly with Companies House, does the software provider need to register as an ACSP, or is it the IP firm using the software?
Okay, so it pretty much depends on how that software package works. There are different types of ways that software interacts with the registrar. In the true sense of the word, software provider is just responsible for developing a technology. They will sell that to the IP. The IP will use the software, set up their own Companies House account, link to that software package, file through the software. The IP will be the ACSP and will ingest their credentials and their employees' credentials when that information comes through the software package. Other models are whether the software provider themselves ingests data and then delivers that to Companies House through their own account. In that model, technically the software provider should be the ACSP and then sort of doing due diligence on their clients. So it's whoever is delivering the information on behalf of others to the register is the one that we are interested in. And often some software providers have got 2 or 3 links in the chain to the ultimate person who's delivering the information. So we can't go back that far at the point of delivery. So we need the person who's actually putting it into the public domain to be the ACSP. So it pretty much depends on how your software package works.
Moving on to part 7 now, timelines and future developments. So to recap, what are the key dates IP should be aware of regarding ACSP registration and identity verification rollout?
Okay, so ACSP registration is live now. So if an IP wanted to, they could go and register today. But do they need to? Because if they're only interested in filing insolvency documents for their clients and for companies, they're not going to need to do that till spring, summer 2026. So we'll probably be engaging with them in sort of, January, February, perhaps March time 2026.
Okay.
So that they get their ACSP set up, get the credentials, get all their employees added, before we mandate the presenter requirements in spring, summer next year. From an IDV perspective, IDV is obviously live now, but we aren't expecting IDV to be mandated on the company's record until late autumn this year. sort of the tail end of this year, really. So if they have clients or they are set up to do IDV, then get their clients IDV now ahead of late autumn 2025, because from that point, A, they can't incorporate without being IDV'd, and B, if they've got a confirmation statement due in, say we went live 1st of November, they've got a confirmation statement due on 1st of November. If they're not IDV'd, they can't file a confirmation statement, and then it becomes late filing and they're in default. So those are the key dates.
Yep.
And then from autumn this year to late autumn next year, and probably into early 2027, the formal transition is the year autumn to autumn, 25 to 26. But then obviously there's late filing and things like that, which is why it's like to run late 2026, early 27 for IDV, run through the full cycle of organisations on the public record.
You mentioned engagement in, say, January next year, spring. What kind of engagement are you talking about? Like maybe guidance, webinars?
Yeah, so we're doing a lot of targeted communications, and our communications are targeted to the releases. So in the run-up to identity verification in the autumn, when we have a firm date, our comms specifically to organisations, particularly those organisations with confirmation statement dates in the relevant months post-go live, they'll be targeted to them. There'll be wider global comms. Okay. Obviously, we've got our guidance on our website. We've got our campaign site. There's blogs. I'm doing a lot of this sort of thing. And as dates become firmed up, I'll start sort of communicating that more widely to stakeholders as well. So as we move through the phases, IDV, we'll see probably another small spike in ACSP registrations in the lead up to that, because obviously we've got early adopters, but in any introduction of a new process, you've got people who adopt early and then people that leave it to the last minute. I think if you leave it to the last minute and we have a spike, then your ACSP might not get set up when you actually need it to be. Mm-hmm. So have a think about when you actually engage with us before sort of autumn this year, and make sure that you've got an ACSP and you can do transactions for your clients.
And you mentioned much earlier on in the conversation that you're speaking to the insolvency service directly. Do you know whether they've published some guidance or communications to the profession?
Can't answer for the insolvency service. I know my colleagues in GPT have been engaging with the insolvency service.
Okay.
I would expect that the insolvency service would engage with the IPs because it's their legislation, it's their policy. I'm expecting them to, but obviously I can't answer for them because I'm not affiliated with the insolvency service.
No, it's fair enough. It's fair enough. So part 8, practical advice and where to find information. So what are your top 3 tips that you would reiterate specifically for IPs embarking on registration?
Okay, so there's our guidance, how to register as an ACSP on gov.uk. If you type Companies House and then click on the gov.uk link, hit guidance, hit identity verification, there's a page that'll pop up and there's about 6 or 7 links to guidance on identity verification as an individual, identity verification through an ACSP, how to register as an ACSP. There's links in there to the actual registration process, to the verification process. There's a lot of guidance. Also, the registrar rules are published in terms of the sort of toolbox that's available to an IP or an ACSP that wants to engage in identity verification process. So there's a heck of a lot of material out there. And then early warning through our campaign site. Yeah, that's generally the first place that we publish things. Things like LinkedIn, Meta, those kind of things. Our external comms team are all over sort of massive campaigns, accounting web, lots of, sort of corporate communications that we've engaged with other organisations as well. So it is quite widespread and extensive, our comms, and it'll just get ramped up as we come to each big release. The campaign will go up and then it'll lull and then start building towards the next big release.
Brilliant. And I have to say, the comms I've seen from Companies House on LinkedIn or the website have been really helpful. They're not overly complex or detailed. They're very much to the point. So, I would applaud the comms team at Companies House.
Yeah, I've worked a lot with the comms team, particularly with ACSPs. If they are listening, they do a very, very good job.
Okay, well, I've got 2 more questions. The first is, what is the main message Companies House wants IPs to take away regarding the new ACSP regime?
Okay, so the new ACSP regime, once it's set up, you shouldn't see much difference to how it works now. You're currently registered with Companies House as an IP, and ironically, I think IPs, the one area where Companies House knows actually a lot about you, because you register as an IP, we have your IP number, we set you up on our system, you've got your address. We know everything about you already. Just ACSPs is a more formal arrangement for that. But once it's set up, if you use software, if you use web, we'll ingest the information digitally. If you still file on paper, we'll create a process for you to be able to give us your credentials on paper in the same way as you do now. So there shouldn't be any extra effort once you are set up as an ACSP. The effort is that we set you up, you set all your employees up, and then we know who is filing for you on any document, on any transaction that hits the register.
Thank you very much, Mark.
You're welcome.
Before you go, I have one final question, and I ask this of all guests. What is the one thing that you have learned during your career so far that has stayed with you throughout?
Learn from mistakes. Yeah, I made loads.
I did too.
I think there's a very famous person, it might have been the wife of a president, that said she learned more from one mistake than she did from doing 1,000 things right. And yeah, it's true. Don't be afraid to do something because you think it'll go wrong. Better have tried and failed than not to try something. I've been doing this a long time now. I failed loads and I'm still here.
Brilliant. No, I really like that answer. Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you for coming on. It's been really insightful. Thank you.
Nice, comfortable chat.
Thank you for listening. I hope you found the discussion informative and useful as usual. Thank you again to Mark for joining me on the podcast. Should any members wish to be a guest on the podcast, please contact me. My contact details are on the R3 website or simply message me on LinkedIn. Many thanks.